It is now time for a very special segment on this program.
Yes.
I'm looking forward to it. We're going to talk about DNA testing and in regards to family research. And with Cecilia Fabos-Becker. Hello, Cecilia.
Hello.
And, well, she's the expert. Tony Becker is also here.
Hi there.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, Cecilia.
Well, I graduated with degrees in history and anthropology a number of decades ago from the University of Minnesota. Took one of the first genetics classes at a time when genetics was in its infancy. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of irrelevant. Mm-hmm. But other than that, I've been doing family history research and trying to apply the research principles and methodologies developed in history and anthropology to it for some 45 years. So, and I got interested in DNA testing when people began doing it and trying to use it to substitute for family history research. That is, spending a lot of time finding the documents that prove the existence of ancestors, their identities, where they lived, and so forth and so on. And over time, it has seemed to improve and become more useful. And so I did start taking the tests myself. I also started doing a lot of reading about it to find out how far it had come since the early days of genetics and how much was being tested that could be useful to people doing family history research.
So why is it becoming more popular? It seems like there's I first heard about this a few years ago from Henry Louis Gates in the PBS show Finding Your Roots. Where he does extensive both DNA testing, yes, but also the traditional research into archives and wherever, depends on where the person's from. He goes to Europe and Africa and all over the place to find people's history. It's really interesting.
And that's part of the reason why DNA is becoming more popular, is because it does take time and money to go and travel to all the places where you might find records. When you look at things like Robert Louis Gates' show, he's going back to a number of different states in the East. He has to be there when the buildings are open. This means he's usually he and whoever else is accompanying him, his team are spending overnight in a hotel. They're buying meals. It's not cheap to do family history research. Very little of the documentation that exists is online yet. The last article I saw said that of all the vital records that still exist, after all the fires and wars and everything like this, of all of those, only 10 to 20% of them are online. Most of them are only accessible by either hiring someone or communicating with someone in the counties where you are trying to find records and asking them to do research for you, usually paying them to do research, or you have to travel to these counties and states yourself to access the documents. Sometimes even if they are available to be put online, counties and states today are not doing so because of concern over the privacy laws. Mm-hmm. They want to know the researcher who comes into the courthouse and asks to see these records.
So
they
these
want
are
someone
not
looking over their shoulder to make sure that's the only records they're looking at and not something else in the archives.
So these are not public records?
No, they're supposed to be public records. The vital records, wills, and probates, civil disputes. I mean, when you file
births and deaths,
births and deaths. When you file a lawsuit against someone else, that is a public record. Mm-hmm. But it is a gray area because they are stored with everyone else's records, and there is a certain amount of continuity also with some records, like a probate record. If an heir was left out, there is the heirs or that descendants of the heirs can come back years later and say, well, I want a piece of this. And now you've got to go back, open the whole case, and redo it. So there's also the issue that the names and particulars of long dead people have been used to create false IDs. There are cemeteries today that are very, very restrictive about people going in to them, and they want to know who's going in and when, precisely because there have been people who have gone in to steal names and dates for and birthdays for
identity theft,
and for false IDs for illegal immigrants and such.
So, who is behind and what is behind the increase in DNA research?
Okay, a lot of it, two areas. One is medical research, because we are finding that that even with twins and twin studies, both twins will not necessarily get cancer. One will, one won't. If both get cancer, one will respond to one treatment and get better, another one needs another treatment. There are variances as to how you treat illnesses because it's individualized. A lot of illness is human reaction to the environment, and since the human DNA is different from one person to another, the reactions are going to be different. So
I'm having a hard time figuring out what that has to do with DNA with.
Okay, a lot of illness has a susceptibility that has a genetic component. That if you have certain genes or certain combinations of genes,
you have a proclivity.
You have developed perhaps a susceptibility to particular illnesses at certain times, with certain triggers. That's genetic. So you get a chance to prevent, if you know what they are. If you have a really good family history and a good DNA database and testing, you might be able to prevent and avoid the triggers that cause cancer or cause heart disease.
Okay, I have heard. I had a friend of mine ask me, related to what you were just saying, that he's concerned that if more information is found out, if he does more information on himself, and if it becomes public, that various health entities will use that information against giving him coverage or some very close variation on that.
Or raise the premiums sky high. Right, yes. Right. That became a concern almost as soon as DNA testing became used in the fields of justice, and also for birth defects. And the states have almost entirely passed laws, strong laws, between 1997 and 2008 to prohibit exactly that. Insurance companies and healthcare companies cannot use DNA tests or DNA testing to deny you coverage, to limit your coverage, to raise premiums, to put you into risk categories or anything like this. There are very, very specific laws. There's a couple of databases online. I found one just a couple of days ago that literally list the legal codes in the states, state by state, for all 50 states, where you can actually look them up and find out exactly what the codes say. But this became a very early concern, and there are only 5 states as of 2008 that had not yet passed laws, and I'm quite sure that since it's now 10 years later that most of them have passed some sort of laws.
So there has been a legal barrier to health companies, insurance companies doing that.
They can get major fines and lose their licenses.
It sounds like you're saying these are mostly state level.
These are state codes. These are and codes means laws. These are state laws that were passed by the legislatures, and there are enforcement agencies to make sure that if an insurance company breaks the law, that they are punished.
So what role, if any, does the federal government have in that?
Very little. They left it to the states.
Okay.
In California, we have very strong laws.
Very interesting. I thought, until you said that, I thought it was mostly enforced by the feds. I didn't realize it was at the state level. So back to DNA testing. Obviously, the technology has evolved from a kind of a complex thing to something fairly, from the consumer's point of view, fairly simple. Can you explain the process?
Okay, the test itself is pretty simple. And straightforward. You either basically spit into a test tube, you use saliva, DNA is extracted from saliva, or else you take the equivalent of a Q-tip and do a cheek swab and put that into a test tube. It has some chemicals in the test tube that get added, which when you put the top on in a particular way, that preserves the sample and begins to work on the sample to separate the DNA from everything else. So it's coming from you. It's a lot simpler than taking a blood test for those who are squeamish, or anything else, or someone said, or cutting off a fingertip or something. It is very simple. What they are looking for in a DNA test is they are looking for a very small percentage of DNA that is unique to each individual, because 99.5% of all persons' DNA is identical. From you, me, the man, 100 yards down the street.
What percentage again?
99.5%
Wow.
of human DNA is identical in all human beings. And there is a reason, a couple of reasons. First of all, modern humans are not that old, geologically speaking. We're one of the last species to develop, or most recent species to develop. The second thing is we had a near mass extinction incident 72,000 years ago. We had a supervolcano blow up near the equator. You may have heard of it. Its modern descendant is Krakatoa. Well, Krakatoa had a great-grandfather that was, shall we say, the grandmother of all volcanoes. And it caused extinctions of large and small species all over the world. This is when some of the large
72,000. That's not obviously the dinosaurs.
No, this is if you're thinking, okay, if you've been to museums around California, what you see are the creatures that are what they call the mega beasts that are mammals. And and a lot of them are only a few million years old, and quite a number of them started disappearing around 72,000 years ago. That's when that volcano blew up.
Interesting. So
there
were no humans then.
There was a small group of humans that survived, or ancestors to modern humans. There were small groups of Neanderthals and Denisovans and others that are part of the human family that survived. Here and there, but it was the humans that finally predominated. The modern
Homo sapiens.
Yeah, Homo sapiens, what we called originally Cro-Magnon, say 40 to 50,000 years ago.
Back to the DNA.
Okay.
Before we get too far into
the
arcana of archaeology.
So let me explain what they're looking for in that last little 0.5%. Okay. They are looking for basically 500,000 out of 10 million nucleotides. Single nucleotide, I know. Polymorphism.
I thought those orbited Mars.
Mm-hmm. No, these kind of run around your bloodstream and everywhere else in your body. But a nucleotide is the building block of a gene. It is the four chemicals that are usually described as ACGT.
I've seen that.
Yeah, you've seen that. Okay.
I don't understand it, but I have seen it.
And it's you get these little blocks, and they get together.
And the way they get together determines.
It determines the individual characteristics, and it's only these 500,000 out of a whole possible 10 million that determine things like your hair color, your eye color, the shape of your nose, may even predispose you to balding or not, or in my case, a nice gray widow's peak or something, and the other,
the characteristics of individuals within the larger group of human beings.
Right.
That's what these 1/2 of 1% of, and
why would you be looking for all the things that are all identical?
Well,
You're looking for the difference.
You wouldn't. You'd look for the difference. So what sorts of things can these things that are different in terms of ancestry research, what can they tell you?
Okay. You have two types. Let me describe the three types, the three tests that are most commonly done. The very most common test that people buy, it's the cheapest. It does pretty much the least, really, is what they call autosomal. These are all the DNA of this 500,000 nucleotides and so forth that is not sex related. This is DNA that you get from either parent and all the ancestors of those parents. Okay, that can tell you ancestry. It can tell you your cousin relationships. It can tell you where your ancestors came from, at least within regions. To some, and it is getting to the point where as the databases grow, it can tell you more specifically countries. When you get the other two tests, what is called the Y-DNA test, which is the male sex chromosome test, and the mtDNA test, which is the mitochondrial DNA that is on the female chromosomes that pass from mother to daughter, you can then follow that chain back much further, because it changes very little from mother to daughter across the generations. So you can literally use an mtDNA test, for instance, to tell who your female ancestor was about 45,000 years ago.
Wow.
Wow.
Or 30,000, or what, depending on which haplogroup you're in. Okay, now I've got another term that I got to explain.
Well, or not. So you've alluded to the fact that databases are getting bigger.
They are getting bigger.
Why is that important?
Okay, because we have 7 billion people on the planet, and if you want to have a sample that compares with you, where you can say, okay, I fit here, you need to have that sample in the database. And with Americans, we have people in this country who have come from 190 some odd other countries. And each country has differences within its population as a result of wars, invasions, movements of people, a volcano blowing up, that sort of thing. You need a really good sample. Right now, the databases are limited because most of what's in the database are Americans. We have there are 3 major databases, 3 major companies that have the largest databases. Together, if you remove the overlap, because people do test with more than one company,
Sure.
It's around 13 million people. Now,
Not very many.
it's not very many when you're thinking 7 billion people on the planet.
Plus, some groups are going to be represented much more heavily than others.
That is correct.
So who are the most heavily represented groups?
The most heavily represented group is African Americans, and there is a very good reason for it. They're the ones that have the least written records about themselves in this country, and they were ripped from their countries in Africa, came here, treated as property. You look at even the estate records as I have, and you're lucky if you see somebody's first name.
Yeah.
And they'll say something like, well, Bessie or Betsy,
Age 13.
Age about 30, and her child, unnamed, is going, goes together, in an estate distribution or something. There's nothing about how they lived, how they died, nothing.
And a lot of times, because of the nature of slavery, African Americans were discouraged from writing from learning to read and write.
In fact, there were laws passed in the very early 1800s to prohibit you teaching African Americans to write.
Absolutely.
And then the other part of it is, in their own countries, when the slaves were first taken, these were African kings who were making war on one another, developing their states and ripping families apart, ripping kingdoms apart. Even in Africa, they want to know where they came from. And they want to know what happened to their cousins and relatives who were ripped away from them during these wars and ended up in the United States. Did they do well? Are they happy today? Are their descendants happy today? So there are people reaching both ways. You have the African Americans trying to find their roots in Africa and their cousins, and you have the Africans reaching back and saying, we want to know how you're doing.
Yeah.
And
hey, cousin.
Hi, cousin, how are you doing?
So African Americans are heavily represented because
Yes.
they're as a group more typically interested.
Yeah.
What about the rest of us? What other groups are?
Okay, the second largest group right now are probably the Scots and the English. And as I've written a couple of articles, and I said it's a good thing, not just for medical reasons, but also if we want to bring the world together, we want people to get to know what their cousins are like today, what their ancestry is like, how did they come to be the way they are, have the attitudes, and how does it differ from their cousins today? Mm-hmm. And we want people to travel. And it's very true that many Americans will travel where they think they had roots. Gee, this is a big tourist bonanza. Mm-hmm. If more countries in Europe, for instance, would have more DNA testing and samples, because now they can link up with Americans here and can say, come and visit your cousins back here. Spend a few American tourist dollars. We could use this for our local economy.
And the vast majority of Americans, everyone except for Native Indians, Native Americans, are immigrants.
Exactly.
In a relatively short
300 years, roughly
exactly.
300 to 400 years.
And so does any of this have to do with, how does ethnicity, I'm not sure how to ask the question, how does ethnicity affect the results of DNA, if it does at all?
Well, okay, one way that it affects it is if a group has stayed in the same place for a very long period of time. They've adapted very well to their environment. It means that, in general, without any new fresh changes coming into the environment, they're going to have, they're likely to have greater longevity, fewer genetic-related diseases, and so forth. With Americans being as mixed as we are, we're still adapting. We're adapting in two ways. We're adapting to an environment that is new to all the European immigrants and the Asian immigrants and the African immigrants, that's only 300 years, 400 years compared with 1,000 years, 10,000 years that they've had a chance to adapt in Africa, Europe, or Asia. So we have a new environment. The second thing is we are now, as Americans, we have intermarried with all these other groups, and that brings genetic differences as well. So we, Americans, Australians, Canadians, basically, and when I say Americans, I mean all of North and South America.
Sure.
And not just the United States or Canada. Australians, New Zealanders, we are, in a way, almost a new subspecies, because there has not been any genetic mixing like this in a very long time.
Because before at least the 19th century, few people moved around.
Yeah, tended, for generation after generation, most people tended to marry within 10 or 20 miles of where they were born.
Well, transportation didn't exist.
Yeah, the only one.
I mean, it existed.
Yeah, it existed, but it was horse or it was boat.
Or it was walking. Most commonly, walking.
Yeah, and the only families that sort of mixed distances were often your very rich merchants and your high nobility, because they were forming strategic political and military alliances and trying to avoid wars and trying to gain greater economic and political benefits. And those were the only ones. And even then, they were marrying a few hundred miles apart at the most.
And
not
there's
3,000 miles.
Very few.
Right.
Very, very few.
Exactly.
One thing I don't. This is not really related, but in a way it is. These people that believe that they've lived past lives and all that, they never imagine their past lives were a peasant, and they're always a king or noble or something like that, and that's a tiny percentage of people, incredibly tiny percentage of people. So there's been this upsurge of relatively low cost. I don't know how long it's been going on. It came to my attention just a few years ago where you could, 4 years, according to Tony, I guess, or 4 minutes, I'm not sure.
About 4 years ago they started and just suggested a couple hundred.
So why is that? And why now? I mean, I first heard about this, frankly, with Henry Louis Gates's show.
Yes.
which is less than 4 years old, I'm pretty sure. But, just watching that's interesting. I'm not that interested in celebrities, but it seems now, I talked to a lot of people about this interview, well, not a lot, a fair number, and people are really interested in this. And why is that, do you think?
Two things. Americans today, most Americans, as you point out with modern transportation, they didn't grow up where their parents did. Their children are not going to grow up where they did. They're going to move 3 or 4 times, maybe halfway across the continent or across the continent within one lifetime.
Or overseas even.
They are not even going to know anything about their own parents, their grandparents, nothing. And the DNA is one way to begin to know something about them and to begin to get clues where, if you want to follow up with document research, where to start looking for documents instead of putting a map on a wall and throwing a dart at it.
But this DNA testing can't be that specific, can it?
It can be, the bigger the database. Mm-hmm. The problem is you are comparing the DNA from each individual test with others to see how similar they are, and you hope that you have some of the others where you have more than just a test tube sample. You've been able to accumulate also a bit of a paper trail to know something about those people, so you can say, okay, not only is this sample similar to this sample, but we know that this sample came from such and such an area, and it was a female or a male, something about it. Mm-hmm. And it's being used for ancestry and cousins to develop connectedness, a greater connectedness after we've seen so much being lost. The second reason is, yes, we're finding out that there are genetic components of a lot of illnesses, a lot more than we realized. But it's not that the genes directly cause illnesses. There's very, very few cases where that happens. You can pretty much count them on one hand almost, such as things like sickle cell anemia or hemophilia or cystic fibrosis. Most illness is a genetic predisposition to react a certain way to an unknown change in the environment. There are so many factors in the environment that it's very, very hard to predict what is going to be the trigger. But if there is a trigger, there may be a susceptibility to react a certain way, which may be very unfavorable, such as a cancer. Mm-hmm. If you have
that can be used as a preventative tool.
Exactly,
also.
Because if the more data you have in the database, then the more you can begin to understand what are triggers and how to avoid them, or how to mitigate them.
Did you want to ask a question?
Yes. My father's question is, where did the American Indian come from?
Actually, that's a real interesting question because it's not as simple as a lot of people used to try to think.
They came across the Bering Strait.
Only half of them did. Okay, actually, a little more than half came across the Bering. But there's a group that has been well documented, and there's even been a little DNA that shows up that came across from the Atlantic. And they were in seal-like skin boats, and they followed the seals. They were hunting seals, and they were hunting other sea life. And they were basically following these were the Celutrians. They were a Mediterranean people that were in the Iberian Peninsula and North Africa, and this is Spain, Portugal, and the northern parts of Africa, 25 to 30,000 years ago. They are the ones.
Celubrians.
Celutrians.
I've never heard of that.
Solutreans. And they are the ones who brought a particular set of tools with them, one of which was the immediate antecedent of the Clovis Point.
What's that?
Clovis Point is a particular style of spear point.
Oh, okay.
Okay, and it has been napped in a certain way,
Mm-hmm.
and it has a certain appearance, has certain functionality, as some people would say, And it's very, very distinctive. And it actually started out, the greatest numbers are in the east coast of the United States, and it traveled west all the way to Clovis, New Mexico, which is where it was found, and that's where it's named. Okay.
In English.
So
let me.
The Native Americans are, I'm going to wrap this up real quickly. They're basically half Asian, and half Mediterranean.
Oh, wow.
A light-skinned Mediterranean.
So you're saying the Solutreans crossed the Atlantic Ocean?
Yes, they did.
And how long ago again?
They're estimating about 25,000 years ago, 20 to 25,000.
Way deep into prehistory.
Yes. And, it used to be that they thought, no man was here before 10,000 years ago. Well, they have to keep pushing it back. When I took anthropology at the University of Minnesota, one of my professors studied under a man named William McNeish, who found sandals, and the animals weren't wearing sandals. The seals weren't walking around with sandals on their flippers down, in South America.
Seems unlikely. Yes.
Yeah, and these sandals were dated to 29,000 years ago.
Wow.
They found evidence of hybridization and cultivation of early things like quinoa and amaranth that were...
Those are plants?
And these are plants, and they're grains, and these were being grown 10 to 15,000 years ago.
So you're saying that Native Americans, who I had heard, came across the Bering Strait when there was...
Most of them did, but
the
not...
The Bering Bridge, I
Yeah.
guess it is. Very interesting. So it came from... People migrated here from both sides of
Right.
the so-called old world.
And then let's not forget, I'm sorry to say, but let's not forget the Vikings, because they actually were here. There have been, not only have they found 2 Viking sites in Newfoundland.
I hear they're playing in the Super Bowl.
I wish. I keep asking my very religious cousins to pray a little harder so they quit choking up in the games leading up to it. They get
I guess the Vikings didn't make it.
No, I'm afraid not. They that was an embarrassment.
But the real
major
Vikings
embarrassment.
did make it.
The real Vikings did make it. In fact,
How long ago?
1001 AD, because there is a rock carved right off of the coast of Massachusetts. It's been found by more than one person, who's been photographed periodically since the 1920s. And it has old Viking runes, which can be translated, and it uses...
And they say something like, "Help, where am I?"
No, it literally had... Basically, it's almost like a bit of graffiti saying Leif Erikson was here 1001 AD. And they've looked at the runes to determine how accurate these are, how deep they're carved. Joshua Gates just had it on Expedition Unknown just a few weeks ago.
On the Travel Channel.
On the Travel Channel.
Not familiar with
So
that show.
they were,
Perhaps I should
and they
be.
figured out that when they were describing Vinland, well, the term Martha's Vineyard comes from the grapes that originally were found there. Well, apparently Leif Erikson and his party found the same thing.
Wow.
Very
So they went
interesting.
down as far as Massachusetts, at least.
So everybody can benefit from DNA testing potentially.
Yes, and to me, this is DNA testing is a modern technology that is so potentially powerful and helpful to humans. It's a little like standing and looking at Watt's first steam engine. It is a game changer. And the biggest change is 2 ways: for health, and the other is to reestablish connectedness, to try to promote peace, better understanding, and tolerance of one another. Because the more you realize how similar you are to others, it's a little harder for you to want to abuse them.
Very, very true, I think. Thank you. So what sparked my interest in doing a program like this, interview like this, is I read an article, and if I misquote it, it's my error, not theirs, in the Mercury News about these companies that are apparently making quite a bit of money
Yes.
by selling DNA kits. And I know you've participated
Yes.
in that. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Okay, I read the same article, and I saw another article that was on NBC that was it was interesting because one was very upbeat and one was rather negative.
I would say the Mercury one was negative.
It was negative, and what I read through the article very carefully, and what I realized is the writer of the article was basing his analysis and a little bit of his opinion, perhaps, on a sample of one lady who had a Mrs. Brown who had gotten tests from 3 different companies, and she was concerned about differing results.
Yeah,
and
they
she was
didn't.
quite
They didn't.
upset.
They didn't agree with each other.
They didn't agree with each other. Well, and if you read through the article in detail and reread it, you found that she was really concerned about the smallest percentages of her DNA, the 3% to 1% range, and how much that varied. And
I don't understand that.
Okay, well, it's okay. You start out with you inherit 50% of your DNA from each parent. From each grandparent, It drops to 25%. Each great grandparent, it drops to 12%. You're talking about at this point with 3% and 1%. You're talking about somebody 7 or 8 generations out, and it's a very small percentage.
But if you want to know where you came from, that's
Yes.
what you want to know.
You do want to know the trace. But the other thing is that you're looking at 1%, the 500,000 SNPs, assuming you have a database large enough for people to compare 500,000 SNPs across all the different.
What's SNP?
Yeah.
I guess I have to ask that.
What
is that? What is SMP?
That's the SNPs. The little bitty snippets of that's the single nucleotide
polymorphism.
Polymorphism. That's the only part of the DNA that differs from person to person.
Oh, okay.
Right. And they're trying to, and this is where, because they use estimation for when they have an inadequate database, to say, well, this person with a small percentage is probably related to this group. You're dealing with 2 problems. You're dealing with a very small percentage of this group of SNPs, and you're dealing with a small database. And in which the companies she used were the smallest databases. The largest one that she used had a database of 7. I think she did use Ancestry, but the other 3 were like 700,000 people in the database and less. Ancestry has over 10 million. Okay, and the next 2 in size for database are Family Tree DNA and 23andMe. Those are over 2 million each, and then it drops way off.
So the more people that you have in your database,
the more likely you're going to have accuracy and consistency. And if you're
now, do
using
these
just the smallest
databases
ones,
share their data with each other or no?
one does.
Which one would that be?
Family Tree DNA actually allows you to upload your DNA test results from Ancestry.com and from MyHeritage. It does not yet allow results from 23andMe to be uploaded, which I think is a shame, because they're the 23andMe is the only other one big company that tests for health. Family Tree DNA does through the haplogroups, through that follow male and female. That is the Y DNA and the mtDNA. So it would be useful to compare, for instance, predictions about health with the combined database of 4 million, assuming there's not a lot of overlap. But that is one of the problems with the databases and for the inaccuracies. You have, like I said, a grand total. You take all the databases together and you eliminate the overlap. You've got maybe 13 million individuals.
But they don't share with each other.
And the only way they share is through the one entity if people voluntarily upload their results to that database as well.
What is that one entity again?
Family Tree DNA.
Okay. Now,
and the other thing is every company uses a little bit different mathematical formula to estimate when they've got lapses in the data. That is not enough data in the database. the best one that has been consistently reviewed for cousin matches, shows up in at least 3 different reviews that I've seen, is Family Tree DNA for cousin matches. That when they tell you that so many Centrimorgans match with this person, and this is probably your 3rd or 4th cousin, they're usually a little more accurate than the others. The next best is Ancestry.com. There is and Ancestry has a huge database, which is wonderful. But Ancestry.com DNA wants you to pay a monthly subscription fee to keep being able to access your results and be able to compare them with the other members of the database.
So I have heard, perhaps inaccurately, but is Ancestry.com run by the Mormon Church?
It's not run by the Mormon Church, but there are a lot of Mormons who work in the company. And what happened is for the popular Ancestry and Cousins DNA, it got started, the low-cost test, partly as a result of interest by Mormons because their religion requires knowing your family history. Okay, and
Didn't know that.
Yeah, they do. It's required. You have to do a family history. And part of the reason is that if you want to go to heaven and meet all of your relatives, then you have your relatives baptized in absentia. In order to baptize them, make sure everyone gets to heaven, you have to know who they are. So family history...
Couldn't heaven sort that out, one would think? I mean, I don't know.
You'll have to ask them that. I am not an expert on the Mormon religion by any means.
Do you think, or in your experience, does the fact that Ancestry.com in particular, since that's what we're talking about, or DNA testing in general, is it easy to bias the results?
No, because a lot of the testing, a lot of the machinery, for instance, that breaks down the DNA and sorts it out into the chromosomes and the results that you see on the printout, it's all the same. I mean, it is a science. It's not mumbo jumbo. Mm-hmm. It follows a scientific method. It uses scientific procedures, and the analysis. They've looked at how to establish relations, and they have a term for the relation.
Who are they?
The scientists. They've created a term called Centrimorgans, and it's strings of these single of these SNPs that congregate in certain ways, and they are able, and they found that consistently that they congregate in certain ways, in shall we say clumps, so that, for instance, a female will have exactly about 4,800 what they call non-repeating or non-recombining SNPs within a single generation. And when they are trying to establish relationships, they're looking for a low frequency of recombining in one generation. Because if it can keep combining all through a generation, then how do you know you're related to anyone else? Okay, so they're looking for, and this is a particular group of strings. There are only 4,700 of them in females. In men, there's about 2,900. That's it. There's some complicated reasons why that is, and it's probably more than what people want to think about. They don't want their eyes glazing over when they're trying to focus on their driving.
Men are simpler than women.
Yeah. Yeah, we could say
you
that.
Would say
sometimes
that.
I've seen an awful lot of cartoons that suggest that, and I'm not entirely in disagreement with them.
That's actually the case.
It is the case, actually.
The reason why it's an X chromosome is one leg is missing.
That's right.
Oh.
Yes.
Turns it
if
into a
you
Y.
think about it, you see there's this little X and there's two, they're all
So
same length, and then the Y is short.
Back to the DNA kits that they are selling.
Yeah.
I believe I read in the somewhere, maybe in your article, one of your articles, maybe in the Mercury, that there are 6 or 7 companies that are selling these kits.
Oh, at least. I think the last time it's like 8 or 9 now.
Okay. So which one's best?
Okay, it depends on what you're looking for. That's
Good
the best
question.
way I can describe that. If all you're interested in is ancestry and cousins, and you have enough money to keep buying a subscription every month, go with Ancestry. Ancestry.com. But if you are looking for more than that, and you want just a little bit better accuracy on predicting those cousins, go with Family Tree DNA. And you can get the test from any of 3 companies, and you can then look at 2 databases. By doing that, you can actually, if you buy an Ancestry test kit, you can get your results. You can look at the Ancestry database. You can then upload it to Family Tree DNA. Now you've got, double the pleasure, so to speak. You are now looking at more potential matches, and you can do some comparisons. Mm-hmm.
As time goes by, it sounds to me like as the databases grow,
yes,
and hopefully combine, this will become increasingly accurate.
Yes, what needs to happen is the databases need to increase, and they need to share, because they are making their own mathematical formulas are based on the data they have in their own individual bases. If those bases are relatively small, then their formulas themselves are going to be a little less accurate for predicting whether it's this tiny bit of DNA comes from this country or this region, or you might have a susceptibility to balding or something like this. They need to increase the size of the database, and it needs to be across all 195 countries.
But that will happen.
It will happen only if people insist on it. It's because it does take money.
Doesn't everybody that gets a cheek swab or whatever contribute to the database?
No.
Oh.
You have to voluntarily contribute. They don't want to, we do have privacy laws. Mm-hmm. And even if you get a cheek swab for your doctor's office, it stays right there with your doctor.
Well,
it
but if you
anyplace.
Send it off to, I was talking about ones that were sent off to one of these genealogy companies.
Even then, you can opt to share or not to share. Yeah.
Tony seems to have a question he wants to ask.
There's a checkbox which is normally not checked. If you don't check that checkbox, it stays private.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
What are the downsides of checking the checkbox?
There's not a lot, because even if you check the checkbox, you can choose you can choose to simply enter your name, for instance, and not your email address. There's 2 or 3 different levels of privacy that you can choose, mm-hmm, as to how much you want to share, and how and whether or not you want to other people to contact you. And you can share simply your sample test. You can share your information, your email contact. Yeah. You can share a tree that you've done yourself, where you actually know facts and you actually have documentation to prove it, and that will enable others to say, "Oh, well, I'm linked to you through this person over here. Mm-hmm. Would you like to share information?" Another way you can do it is, if you don't want to list the tree because the tree will have full names, you can list surnames. The Family Tree DNA has a segment that says, what surnames are you looking for in your family history? Mm-hmm. And you can put a little bit of data, such as this surname from this county and this year range. In other words, you can help build the database and the information by choosing to share information. But if you really want your privacy, you don't have to share anything, or you can share as little as you like. This is what I find interesting. But you have to read the materials that come with the test, so you know what, and think about it before you sign.
All the fine print.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with Nat Geo? My father had his DNA done with them. What are your thoughts on that one?
National Geographic is a growing database, but it's still smaller than the others. And they are trying to do more with more samples worldwide. I can see that, but it's the fact of the matter is it's still one of the smaller databases.
So your recommendation, if one is contemplating sending, most of these kits, as I recall, are between $70 and $100.
Yes.
And you're saying that I don't quite get the why the difference between Ancestry and Family Tree. I couldn't quite figure that out. But you want to use one of the bigger databases,
Right.
In your
The reason we chose, my husband and I chose Family Tree DNA, and then our next test is being done with 23andMe. Is
that the same company or
no? Those are two different companies.
No, and we want to say something about 23andMe.
Yeah, 23andMe is one of the two that tests for health. You have a choice of getting just an ancestry test or an ancestry and health.
what does that mean?
They can take a look at your DNA and see if you have markers, genetic markers for a particular genetic illness, such as cystic fibrosis. You may be a carrier for cystic fibrosis, in which case you might want to reconsider having children if you marry another carrier, because there's a real high percentage that one of your children is going to have it.
Is Parkinson's part of that? Like all
Yes.
those things? Do you have genetic codes?
In fact, the reason the 23andMe was started was because the founder's husband, Sergey Brin, has Parkinson's.
Oh, Google.
Sergey
Yes.
Brin's
Mother had Parkinson's.
former wife is the founder of 23andMe.
Oh,
Yes.
the founder of Google.
No,
Yeah.
Sergey Brin
Sergey
is the
Brin
founder
is
of
the founder-
Google.
No, but
Yeah.
His mother is the founder.
He married a lady, but his mother, Sergey's mother, has the disease.
Has Parkinson's disease. So
So-
they told him that he had a certain percentage of chance of inheriting it. So his wife wanted to find find out more about that.
see if she married a loser or not.
No, not exactly, but
Oh.
I mean, because even they knew that as well-educated people, that just because you have a likelihood of inheriting it doesn't mean you're going to inherit it. Like I said, you have to have the right environmental triggers. Not only that, but what's the percentage of people that have those genes that do inherit it? The only way you can figure that out is by studying studying a database,
Getting
with lots
more-
of people,
more data.
More data. Okay. The other thing I was going to say on increasing the database is something we've been doing is we're encouraging known cousins to get databases, to get tests. And because my father comes from a very small family with some rather unique characteristics, shall we say, I'm going to the point of paying for a cousin in Hungary to get the test. And I'm getting
Interesting.
not just the autosomal test, which is your basic non-sex linked, I'm paying for the extra one that does the Y-DNA.
And that can locate your ancestors
that
more precisely.
Males.
That talks about the male DNA in particular. And we had an anomaly in my father's family. I want to see how far back it goes.
Interesting.
And the other thing is we also wanted to find out whether we had a couple other oddball things that we wanted to figure out which generation this came about in. The only way I could do that is because it's in my dad's family is through the male DNA, and
all those relatives are in Hungary.
all those relatives are in Hungary. My father was
Interesting.
the only one born in here in his family.
Mm-hmm.
We wanted to do. So
But
we did
once
the
you're
extra.
in Hungary, they didn't move around that much.
Nope.
And so you can probably, if you can get enough of them to
Right,
do it,
exactly.
it would be quite accurate.
Right.
Wow.
Now, we did have a couple little problems in my dad's family that, they were called the black sheep of their family, and they had a tendency to run afoul of emperors over time, and they more than one tried to wipe the entire family out. So we have a rather small family.
Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Yes, and and because they were aristocrats, of course, they were not the flavor of the month when the communists came to power either.
So you're not paranoid if everybody's after you.
That's right. They're all after you.
Andy and Phil had a very good phrase. They had a very good comment about that a long time ago. Only the paranoid survive.
And guess where he came from?
And
Yeah, Hungary.
he's
Hungary.
Hungarian. Yeah, well, if you live between the Germans and the Russians, you kind of develop these tendencies.
Yeah.
Very interesting. As I recall, and we don't have much time, so you've talked a little bit about how things can be improved. Basically, more people, more swabs, and checking
Yes.
the little box that says, share my information with
Yeah.
other databases.
And I had one more suggestion, and that is, and this is something that I've been, whenever I get a chance, I talk, to talk to someone who's an employee in the companies and government officials. Is look, if the governments want to cut down their health bills and make healthcare a lot more cost effective, and help everyone achieve the goal of living as long and as healthy as they can for all their lives, they need to be on board. They could pay for some of the sampling, for some of the could go district by district and pay for, say, 100 tests in a county or something like this, and help the individual companies. The companies themselves could pay a little more. Take some of your profits, and instead of buying back your stock, pay for some tests in some of the more out of the way places where your database is weak. And so if everyone pulled together, if everyone provided what information they feel comfortable with in the segments of the database that they can provide extra information, if they persuade their cousins to get tests, if occasionally buying as a Christmas gift or a birthday gift a DNA test, and if they lobby the governments and the companies on the basis of cost-effective health care that maximizes the benefit for everyone, then it'll get done. And it'll get done a lot faster than it took to get from the steam engine to, say, the automobile.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Did that hour fly by or what?
It did.
It did.
Because we are at 1 minute until 5 o'clock, I want to reserve a minute or two to mention Tony and his AmeriCeltic newsletter, which is where one of the main... that's where I read your articles. And I had seen the one in the Mercury before, but all of that was an impetus. Well, that's how I found you. And Tony does a very nice online newsletter. And why don't you tell people in a very short time about it?
Okay, so AmeriCeltic's mission is to help people of a Celtic ancestry, and that includes Irish and Scots and Welsh and all these other ancient cultures, reconnect with those cultures. That includes things like family history and Irish music and Scottish dance and on and on it goes.
Most of the newsletter, and I look at it every week, is events in the
mostly
Celtic
music.
In the Celtic world. Yeah, mostly music, but not exclusively, and not even, as I found out, exclusively Celtic.
Nope.
Because this doesn't apply just to Celts.
No,
it applies to everybody. I know, but I can't answer the phone if I'm talking on the air, so I prioritize.
Exactly.
So if you're listening, I will answer the phone when we're done.
Anyway, it's a free newsletter. Just go to AmeriCeltic.net on your browser and fill out the form, and you can have a copy every Friday.
Indeed, and I have found it interesting and useful. In some instances, there have been 2 or 3 different ones where you had articles by various people that were really quite interesting to me, and I'm not particularly exclusively interested in Celtic. I have some Celtic in me, but
we can find out how much.
Apparently. But okay, you are listening to KKUP Cupertino, and that's the law. Now we're compliant. 91.5 FM or kkup.org.
Streams online anywhere in the world.
Indeed.
I'd like to add one thing, too. You'd be surprised how far the Celts have gotten around.
Oh, yeah.
They were my father's family was an extra 18% British DNA that we had no idea existed.
In Hungary.
And then by doing a little research, we found a couple of things. And one thing that may or may not be related was that there were 30,000 or so Scots and Irish that went to Hungary to help build the railroads in East Europe when they were first being built in the 1830s and 40s, and many of them never went home. The current Earl of Breadalbane is a Hungarian named Andras Campbell, and he lives in Budapest.
Wow. Also, the Irish were some of the best mercenaries. in the Middle Ages, and a lot of them stayed in the Europeans
yes.
hired them.
It's called the wild
the
geese.
British didn't. Yeah, the wild geese, exactly.
And then we had Hungary, of course, was on the front line with first the Mongols and then the Turks, and they kept throwing armies at Europe, and the Hungarians figured out with only a few million people we needed allies. So we were literally the Hungarians and and then Austro-Hungarians were advertising all over Europe. Have you got extra sons who've been causing trouble at home? We have a place for them. We need them in our army. We want them to cause trouble for the Turks and the Mongols.
Okay. I wanted to share one piece of personal history. Is a good bit of my, at least I haven't done the DNA test, but a good bit of my ancestry is Welsh. And I remember my grandfather on my father's side when I was a little kid telling me that David. We were all named David, by the way.
Of course, Welsh.
You're from a family of survivors, because when the Romans hunted us for sport, which they did,
yes, they did.
Our ancestors ran faster and got away.
Oh, they knew where all the caves were in the deepest forest. In fact, some of the oldest DNA in the British Isles is in Wales and Cornwall.
Oh wow!
Cornwall, and it shows in a haplogroup called J1, and I have a J1 haplogroup that comes to me from my mother and her mother's mother, and so forth and so on. It is one of the oldest DNAs in Europe. It is originally a Mediterranean DNA. What a lot of people actually came from the area where the Mediterranean joins West Asia.
Okay,
and,
we've got to wrap it up.
Right, you will only find it in Cornwall, Wales, a little bit of the Basque area and the Pyrenees, and then over in Anatolia and such. It is the oldest stuff that was pushed out. But these were the people who built Stonehenge and Newgrange.
Obviously, we could talk for a long time about this, and I kind of knew that. If someone wanted to find out an accessible, more information, what do you think would be the best way to do that?
Well, we do have, there's a lot of ways, but what we've been doing is we've been summarizing our findings on DNA testing and the reviews about them.
Who are we?
My husband and I with AmeriCeltic. We have it on our website. We actually have, in the AmeriCeltic website, there is a section that is called Ancestry. It has topics. One of the topics is DNA, and we have reviews of the.
What about
things,
people that aren't Celtic?
Anyone can check into that. It's there for anyone to use.
As you mentioned, it applies to everybody.
What's your web address?
Okay, the web address.
AMERICELTIC. Again, AMERICELTIC.net. AmeriCeltic.net.
Thank you.
And then the other thing is, I would recommend checking out what the National Institute of Health has to say on genetics and genetic testing. They have a nice section. They have genetics home reference in the U.S.
Is it in English?
Yes, it is in the U.S. National Library of Medicine.
Yeah, hold that up to the microphone so we can.
Yeah, right. So we can see. So you can see this. Okay.
Okay. So again, what was the name of that? National Institute of Health.
That's the National Institute of Health. That's NIH. The U.S. National Library of Medicine has a bunch of articles under genetics home reference.
And according
now this was mostly for medical, but it does cover some. It gives you some understandings of the terms that are used for the ancestry testing as well.
Good.
The companies that you recommend, if one is going to go to one company, I gather, Family Tree DNA,
right,
Ancestry.com, and 23andMe.
Yes.
And I appreciate they're for slightly different,
Yep.
but those are all relatively large databases, and so relatively good accuracy.
Yes.
And accuracy will increase over time, but that's true of a lot of things. Computer power will increase over time too, but we can't wait for it necessarily.
Growing companies are MyHeritage and National Geographic. And
MyHeritage,
and
National Geographic, pretty reputable organization.
Right. Yes. And
I love their channel.
Oh yes, I do too.
I'm
it's
totally,
one of my favorites.
I'm totally hooked on Dr. Pohl.
Yes, and they
The vet.
And
He's a
remember,
vet.
that if you get a test from Ancestry.com, Family Tree DNA, or MyHeritage, you can upload all three of those to Family Tree DNA's database. And
good.
in addition to, if you get the test from Ancestry or MyHeritage, to their own databases.
Okay. I've been talking
Good to
this
know.
afternoon with Cecilia Fabos-Becker, and she's that was a wonderful. I enjoyed it very much. I learned quite a bit. I hope folks out there did too. It is about 8 minutes after the hour of 5 o'clock, but very fascinating. Very fascinating. Once again, AmeriCeltic.com. And take a look at that.
AmeriCeltic.net.
Of all people, I should know that.
We take volunteer contributions for articles, all the notices of any event you'd like.
You do, but and they will ask you warning. They will ask you for money. They don't require it.
Oh no.
I feel my journalistic integrity would be compromised by giving them any money. So, I, for purposes of integrity, can't do that.
But we understand it. We'll take care of it from our end.
I know. That was kind of a joke, actually. So thank you both. This
Thank you
is
for having us.
Cecilia's area of expertise, and a couple of good questions. And Susan and your dad, thank your dad for.
Yes, thank you, Dad.
He had a couple of really outstanding contributions